We've been sold a lie that Western civilization is the pinnacle of human progress, reason, and morality. But that's propaganda talking. I spent the first 21 years of my life fully indoctrinated in Christian conservatism, which I now realize is the cultural foundation for the empire that is the United States. Deconstructing Christianity and colonization is a never-ending journey, and yes, they go hand in hand. But we all have to start somewhere because we all have a part to play in building a better, more equitable future. And that's going to have to start with debunking the idea that we were ever the supreme. Welcome back to the Casey Malone Show. My name is Casey Malone, and I'm so glad you're here. The term Western civilization gets thrown around a lot, like it's some unbroken concept of rationality, democracy, and progress. You've probably seen it in school curriculums, YouTube explainer videos, or more recently in political speeches. This tidy narrative that links ancient Greece to Rome, then to the Enlightenment, and finally to the United States, as though the moral arc of human history just naturally culminated in a Starbucks on every corner and the United States military patrolling half of the globe. But that is not history accurately. That is a narrative that is just marketing, and Western civilization is not a neutral, objective, or even positive concept. It's a kind of branding, carefully constructed to uphold a myth of cultural supremacy. Now, before we get too far into this, Western civilization has traditionally included both the United States and the majority of European countries, though now, under the current United States administration, a lot of European countries are understandably wanting to distance themselves from association with said current administration, and I totally get that. But unfortunately, for the concepts that I'm talking about in this segment, I am going to be using Western civilization to include European countries because we practiced the same colonization, is really what the point is. The narrative we're handed goes like this. Democracy was born in Athens, then went to Rome, then it was preserved through European Christendom, reborn in the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution, and finally reaches its full expression in modern Western democracies like the United States. That's exactly what I was taught in the evangelical fundamentalist Christian high school I attended. But this is a carefully edited and intentionally edited story that leaves out most of humanity's contributions and whitewashes the parts of history that don't fit that script.
Hello everyone, welcome once again to the channel. We've always talked about how the society has created stratification in terms of races and made some races appear stronger and superior to others. For example, we know it that the systems that have existed categorized whites as being superior to blacks and brown people. And this is something that has been followed by law, and it has always led to blacks getting disenfranchised or even whites getting privileged and feeling better about themselves. But is this really the truth? Have whites been superior to blacks and other races that exist? Or is it a creation and a distortion of history that many people over the years have made feel like the truth? In today's video, we're going to look at this, and there is this podcaster who is really debunking some of this information that we continue getting. We must understand that the history we have always been taught was not always like that. A lot of untruths have been fed to us, and we believe them as truths. That is what we want to debunk today. Let's watch this video and then come back and share our thoughts.
This concept of Western civilization frames history as a straight line, linear path from Plato to NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, erasing entire cultures and peoples along the way. Not that I'm a huge fan of everything NATO does, but you get the point. So let's go back to Egypt as an example of ancient history that is kind of just brushed aside because it doesn't really fit into the mainstream Western civilization's historical narrative. Ancient Egypt was much more than what it is usually painted as in most United States public education systems. We are taught that it was just like a civilization of, like there were pyramids, there were pharaohs, that's it. There, this was also the place where the ancient Israelites were slaves in that one story in the Bible. That's it. But the reality is, it was also a hub of very advanced science, mathematics, and medicine. In fact, there's a lot that we still don't know about how advanced, how civilized that society actually was. But what we do know tells us that long before the Greeks, Egyptians had developed concepts of geometry, surgical tools, solar calendars, and in fact, many of the Greek philosophers we revere and hold up today, like Pythagoras and Plato, traveled to Egypt to study. But modern studies in Western civilization rarely mention this because acknowledging that much of Greek thought was influenced by African civilization kind of complicates the neat little story of European intellectual superiority. And the same goes for the African empires of Mali, Songhai, and Ethiopia. These were sophisticated states with complex systems of governance, education, and trade, and these are just a few of many that I'm naming. Timbuktu, actually, often used as a metaphor for remoteness, was actually one of the most important intellectual centers in the world during the 14th and 15th centuries. It was a central trading post on the Trans-Saharan caravan route. Its libraries held tens of thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, law, and theology, many written in Arabic, some in indigenous languages. But you don't hear about Mali or Songhai when people talk about the roots of civilization, even though the study of evolution actually traces all of our genetics back to Africa. And all of that is because the word civilization in Western usage has always been kind of racially coded. Indigenous governance systems in the Americas were also, by the way, complex and democratic. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, operated under a more sophisticated model of federalism long before the United States Constitution was written. In fact, some of the founding fathers, including Benjamin Franklin, and I learned this specifically when researching for this segment, openly admired and borrowed ideas from indigenous political structures. But instead of crediting those systems, of course, the United States positioned Native people as savages in need of civilizing. Their knowledge systems, their contributions to political thought, their ecological wisdom, all erased. Western canon wanted nothing to do with it. And that also makes me bring up the East. Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist philosophies go back thousands of years, and they do offer deep insights into consciousness, ethics, and the nature of reality. The Upanishads contain philosophical and metaphysical discourses that rival anything written in the rest, especially the Bible. You've got to be kidding me. Buddhist logic schools developed system of debate and epistemology that mirror Western rationalism, but we weren't really taught that, were we? These traditions shaped entire civilizations, but they rarely appear in world history textbooks in the United States unless they're framed as spiritual or mystical rather than intellectual. And we all know how the West loves to promote rationalism over intuition, and that's worked out so well. Edward Said's foundational work called Orientalism, which I haven't read in full, but I know of and read a few summaries for this segment. This work makes it clear. He argues that the West only truly defined itself by inventing its opposite, aka the East. Europe constructed the Orient as exotic, irrational, and inferior, so it could see itself as rational, free, and civilized. And this binary specifically emerged from empire. By the way, empire is quite adept at manufacturing distinctions amongst people and creating divisions so that binaries can exist. So as Europe expanded through colonization, it needed a story or a narrative that justified its domination so that people could consent to this domination. And so it told one that it was the bearer of enlightenment and order in a chaotic, backward world. The myth of Western civilization still lingers today in every conversation that positions the Western world as a beacon of liberty, and everyone else is catching up. So when we talk about Western civilization, what we're really talking about is a curated version of history that selectively includes whatever makes Europe and later the United States look like the natural leaders of humanity. It's not that Greek philosophy or the Enlightenment weren't important, it's that they didn't develop in a vacuum. They weren't inevitable. They were deeply interwoven with and often directly borrowed from other cultures that were later dismissed as primitive or underdeveloped. And the worst part of this is the West didn't necessarily just ignore these other knowledge systems or cultures, it actively erased them. Colonizers have burned libraries, okay? Not just military bases, libraries, not to mention hospitals and civilians. Missionaries have intentionally and systematically destroyed temples and sacred texts. Entire languages and oral histories were wiped out in the name of civilization. This was an active intellectual colonization, and it is why colonization has such a stronghold in the minds of all of us to this day. European scholars claimed the mantle of universal knowledge while portraying the rest of the world as its raw material where it gets its inspiration, but not its actual manifestation of intellectualism. And this intellectual theft still shapes our world. It still affects all of us. It affects what's taught in schools, who gets published, whose voices seem as authoritative and whose seem as fringe or extreme. It defines the boundaries of credible philosophy and real science, and it reinforces a worldview in which Western institutions are the default, objective, neutral, advanced, while everyone else is seen as derivative, emotional, or spiritual. When people say the West is more advanced, more rational, or more civilized, they're not stating a fact, they're regurgitating propaganda. Western civilization is not a civilization. It's a story, a narrative, a brand, a story that justifies empire and cultural erasure. And it's time we stop telling it uncritically without really questioning it. Because the real history of human progress is far more global, collaborative, and interconnected than the myth allows. And when we recognize that, we open ourselves up to a far richer understanding of who we are and who we could become. One of the most persistent lies in the myth of Western supremacy is that the West, and particularly Christianity, is somehow responsible for modern scientific advancement. We're taught that without the guiding hand of Christianity, the world would still be in the Dark Ages. But history tells a very different story. The Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, often held up as pinnacles of Western intellectual achievement, did not emerge because of the church. Let's be so fucking for real. They emerged in opposition to it. And much of the foundational knowledge that powered these so-called Western breakthroughs didn't originate in Europe at all. It was inherited, borrowed, or stolen from other civilizations, particularly the Islamic world, South Asia, and East Asia. Let's start with the tension between Christianity and early science, which is still very prominent to this day. Let's remember that the Catholic Church has never been known for nurturing scientific inquiry. It's not out of left field to recognize that it has rather spent a fuck ton of time and energy actively suppressing it. The church maintained a monopoly on knowledge for so long and punished deviation pretty fucking harshly. Scientific progress didn't flourish under Christianity. It had to fight its way through it via visionaries like Galileo and Bruno. Meanwhile, while Europe was slowly crawling out of the intellectual stranglehold of the church, the Islamic world was already thriving in what's now known as the Islamic Golden Age, spanning roughly the 8th to the 14th centuries. During this time, Muslim scholars and scientists were building libraries, translating Greek and Persian texts, and producing groundbreaking original work in every field from mathematics to medicine. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became a renowned center of learning and innovation. It was a research institute, a translation hub, and it was almost also kind of like a think tank all rolled into one. And this is important because we are constantly getting the message here in the United States about how when you compare the religion of Islam with the religion of Christianity, it's supposedly obvious how backwards and unprogressive and even violent Islam is in comparison with the more modernized, civilized, and even moral faith system of Christianity. But as many of you know, I will never stand for the idea of any patriarchal Abrahamic religion to be better than any other. Just a few hundred years ago, the argument about which religion was more violent, oppressive, and uncivilized would easily have gone to Christianity. But then, Western empires like Britain, France, etc. started systematically using whatever iterations of Christianity suited them to further expand their colonialism and imperialism throughout the rest of the goddamn world. After they spent centuries fighting incredibly bloody internal wars about Catholicism versus Protestantism versus Anglicanism or whatever. As a result, societies that have been non-Christian for a long-ass time are understandably resistant to the idea of a global Christendom. I will never be a supporter of religious fundamentalism or religious authoritarianism or religious extremism of any faith, but to suggest that in the grand scheme of human history, any specific patriarchal Abrahamic religion is any better or worse than one of the others, that's bullshit. They are all so harmful, and frankly, we could do without the lot of them. And that's not to say that everyday practitioners of faith-based systems are inherently violent or unwell. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm not arguing that there shouldn't be the freedom to practice whatever religion you want. Of course there should be. I'm not trying to suggest that good things have never come out of religious environments. But what we're often hearing in the United States, even amongst the atheist community in which I participate, is that somehow Christianity has on the whole been less harmful as Islam and has produced more positive results for the progress of humankind. But this is not true, and it's a narrative that is deliberately intended to indoctrinate us into thinking that other cultures, other religions, other peoples throughout the world deserve our quote-unquote civilizing efforts, through war. But I digress. Let's look at some examples of ways that the progress of human science and achievement has actually been more global in efforts and not so much concentrated within the powers of a few famous white scientists. Consider, and please excuse all of my pronunciations here, Al-Khwarizmi, who gave us the word algorithm. He systematized algebra and wrote foundational texts that introduced Hindu Arabic numerals to the Western world. There's also Ibn al-Haytham, who wrote the Book of Optics, establishing the scientific method centuries before Francis Bacon. He conducted controlled experiments with light and vision, laying the groundwork for modern physics and optics. Then there's Avicenna, who wrote the Canon of Medicine, a text that became standard reading in European medical schools for centuries. He outlined treatments for numerous diseases, surgical procedures, and diagnostic techniques that were far more advanced than anything happening in Christian Europe at the time. And outside of the Islamic world in China, scholars had already developed the printing press centuries before the Gutenberg press, and I should not have been an adult when I learned that. They invented paper, gunpowder, the compass, and seismographs. Chinese astronomers charted comets and eclipses with extraordinary precision. Their civil service exams required a deep understanding of mathematics, ethics, and governance centuries before such ideas caught on in the West. In India, the concept of zero had already been developed by the 5th century CE, a revolutionary idea that underpins all modern computing. No big deal. Indian mathematicians contributed to trigonometry, calculus, and infinite series, which is a thing that I learned one time in calculus. And in the realm of language and logic, Panini's ancient Sanskrit grammar laid the foundations for linguistic theory, arguably making him the world's first formal linguist. All of this knowledge made its way to Europe through trade, contracts, and sometimes peaceful cultural exchange. The Crusades, for all their brutality, did open up contact between the Islamic world and Christendom. European scholars began translating Arabic texts into Latin, often without crediting the original authors. It's through this process that the so-called Western Enlightenment was born. European thinkers stood on the shoulders of global geniuses but rarely acknowledged them. It wasn't a birth of knowledge, it was a conglomeration of it. And once that transfer was complete, Western historians whitewashed the original story to make it look indigenous to their culture. That's not to say Europe made no contributions, but the idea that the West generated science independently from first principles out of sheer brilliance and Christian fucking virtue is laughably false. This matters because it challenges the core of the Western supremacy myth. If science, the prized emblem of Western modernity, wasn't purely Western, then what else have we misunderstood? What other narratives and messages have we been told that we should be questioning? Is there anything that makes us better, actually, than the rest of the world? Is there any core fundamental reason we should be putting America first? When people point to the scientific achievements of the West as evidence of cultural or moral superiority, we have to push back, because the roots of science are not nation-based. They're not Christian. They're not Western. They are global. They are collaborative. And they are the results of thousands of years of shared human curiosity. The real story of science isn't a linear journey all the way to NASA. It is a vast, messy, multicultural tapestry of ideas, exchanges, and breakthroughs that no one civilization can lay claim as their own. The idea that the West is uniquely rational, democratic, or moral, which is a key one, is one of the most powerful and dangerous myths in modern history. It's the ideological scaffolding that props up everything from foreign intervention to economic exploitation to white supremacy. This belief that Western civilization represents the pinnacle of reasoned and ethical governance does more than just distort history. It enables ongoing violence by disguising it as benevolence. It says things like, we're bringing these other people liberation and civilization. We're told that Western societies are more enlightened, more logical, and more just. But if you actually trace what the West has done with its supposed rationality, let's be real. You'll find a legacy soaked in blood, control, war, colonialism, genocide, and the list goes on. The unfortunate truth that we are not taught in elementary school is that all of this was very much intentional. We are talking about genocidal colonization. European empires didn't just stumble into domination. They didn't manifest it because they happened to be better. They planned it. They mapped, measured, and cataloged the lands they would take and the people they would destroy. The civilizing mission was framed as a rational moral duty or responsibility, but in practice,
the notion that white people have always been supreme and more civilized than other races is a myth, rooted in historical distortions and selective narratives, often propagated to justify colonialism, slavery, and racial hierarchies. Civilization, broadly defined as the development of complex societies with advanced cultural, technological, and political systems, has existed across all religions of the world, long predating modern racial categories. Ancient African empires like the Kingdom of Askum, Mali Empire, and Great Zimbabwe developed sophisticated trade networks, universities, and architectural marvels such as Timbuktu centers of learning, which rivaled or surpassed European societies of their time. Similarly, the Indus Valley Civilization, ancient China's Han Dynasty, and Mesoamerican societies like the Maya and Aztec produced remarkable advancements in mathematics, astronomy, and governance. These examples challenge the idea that civilization is a uniquely or predominantly white achievement, revealing the lie of white supremacy as a construct born from Eurocentric biases rather than historical fact. There are a lot of history that dispute this notion that whites have always been superior to blacks. And these are just examples of developed societies that existed everywhere in the world, in Africa, in the East Asia, and every other part of the world. So when someone comes to tell us that blacks were inferior and have always been inferior since time immemorial, these people are distorting the truths, and it seems they have not had good time in their history class. I think we as a people, especially black people, must be proud of our civilizations. It is only that the white people came during slavery. They justified their civilization as being superior to that of others. And that is why some of us feel intimidated when we approach whites or even talk about their creations. But if you look at the discoveries that happened in the United States, much of those things were derived from black people, were derived from African societies that already were civilized before even the civilization that is in Eurocentric areas ever existed. The claim of white supremacy often hinges on a narrow Eurocentric definition of progress that ignores or devalues non-Western contributions. For instance, during Europe's Middle Ages, often portrayed as pinnacle of the early Western civilization, much of the continent lagged behind the Islamic Golden Age, where scholars in the Middle East and North Africa perceived and expanded upon Greek and Roman knowledge, while Europe was mired in feudalism. The Song dynasty in China developed technologies like gunpowder and the compass. White Europe was centuries away from comparable innovations. These global achievements demonstrate that no single race has monopolized intellectual or societal advancements. The narrative of white supremacy conveniently omits these parallel developments, cherry-picking moments of European dominance often tied to a later imperial exploit to create a false impression of universal superiority. This myth was further entrenched during the colonial era, when European powers weaponized pseudoscience and racial theories to justify exploitation. In the 18th and 19th centuries, pseudodisciplines like phrenology and social Darwinism were used to classify non-white people as less evolved, despite their society's complexity and resilience. For example, the transatlantic slave trade disrupted thriving African societies, yet European narrative framed African as savage to rationalize enslavement. Similarly, colonial depictions of indigenous people in the America ignored their intricate systems of governance and environmental stewardship. These distortions were not evidence of white superiority, but deliberate propaganda to uphold economic and political dominance. The lie of white supremacy, therefore, is not only historically inaccurate, but also a product of power dynamic that suppressed competing narratives. So it is something that black people have been subjected because of the lies that Eurocentric narratives have continued to propagate. There is no such thing as a white supremacy or whites being supreme. They have never been supreme at any time. And in fact, if you look at history, you realize that people from Africa were more civilized back then compared to what European nations could have had before. So you can't come and say that blacks have been inferior and whites have been superior all this time. That claim must be debunked from the onset. Moreover, the concept of whiteness itself is a relatively recent innovation, not a timeless marker of superiority. Before the 17th century, Europeans' identities were tied to ethnicity, religion, or nationality. Irish, Italian, or Catholic, for example, rather than unified white race. The consolidation of whiteness emerged largely to unify European settlers against colonized or enslaved populations, as seen in the Americas during slavery. This constructed identity was less about inherent superiority and more about creating a social hierarchy to maintain control. The fluidity of racial categories, such as how Irish and Italian immigrants were once excluded from whiteness in the United States, exposed the arbitrariness of tying civilization to race. If whiteness was not always a fixed or universal concept, the claim of its eternal supremacy collapses under scrutiny. Finally, the persistence of the myth ignores the interconnectedness of human progress. Civilizations have always thrived through exchange, not isolation. The Renaissance in Europe, often cited a high point of Western civilization, was fueled by knowledge from the Islamic world, African trade routes, and Asian innovations. Similarly, modern technological advancements rely on global contributions from the African origins of mathematical concepts to the Indian foundations of computer science. To claim whites are supreme is to erase the collaborative nature of human achievement and perpetuate a lie that serves divisions over truth. By acknowledging the diversity of civilization and their mutual influence, people are able to dismantle the false narrative that any race has a monopoly on progress or civility. I guess you understand what I mean by saying that there is nothing like whites being supreme or whites being better than black people. If you talk about civilization, they copied it from Africa. Much of discoveries that they have used to project and promote their technology comes from Africa. We have just talked about how mathematics originated from the African continent. How on earth would physics exist without mathematics? And the technological tools that are created right now cannot really be existent out of mathematics. So you realize that everything that really happens right now has some backing from different societies. You have to mix them up to create the best outcome that we have today. So we don't have a space where somebody can come and say that blacks have never been anything in their lives. Share your thoughts down in the comment section. And if you're watching us for the first time, please consider subscribing to the channel, like the video, and share. Thank you, and let's meet on the next one.